For its leaders. By the temple, I mean its leaders. Unfortunately, the current head of the temple was Grand Master Gilbert Joseph Harail. So, where is this Eric? Said Harail, sighing. He understood Allain, they couldn't leave Gunnar's son or anyone from the Hardrada lineage in that pit. In the stable, my lord. He'll join the novices after finishing his tasks there. He won't cause any trouble here, will he? Asked right-hand Giorgio. He might, but he won't initiate it, my lord, Allain said without lying or circumventing the truth. When Giorgio said, I wouldn't want any harm to come to the sole legacy of our beloved friend, Allain smiled and put the empty cup on the table, saying, Lord, if it comes to that point. As he smiled with a grin that unnerved both men, believe me, we won't need to worry about Eric. Eric Hardrada had followed the order given by Allain, gone to the stables. The sun had risen high, and the air had become increasingly hot. The young man hated the hot weather, feeling like he was in an oven of sorts. Despite the oppressive heat, Eric, who continued to move without relaxing, looked at the temple symbol made on the thick white fabric at the entrance. 2 knights on horseback. There were hundreds of war horses ready for action from a brotherhood that had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Eric recalled what Allain had told him before he came. The order had been founded long ago by the French knight Hugh de Paynes from Champagne and 7 other knights. Although the names of the others were known, the 9th knight's name had not been recorded. The primary duty of the knights in the temple was to protect Christian pilgrims in Jerusalem and the Holy Lands. Essentially, it was a religious warrior group. Those who joined the brotherhood gave their wealth to the order and served in the temple houses, temple fortresses, or farms of the brotherhood. The order provided for all their needs. Bound by their oaths, this brotherhood was a closed community with strict and clear rules of conduct. The center of the community was here, the Temple of Solomon. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem had allocated the historic complex on the Temple Mount to them. This structure was commonly referred to as the Temple of Solomon, and thus the brotherhood soon became known as the Knights Templar or simply the Templars. Most of the horses in the small cabins were Western horses strong enough to bear the weight of the knights. Most of the war horses had to be quite unruly because they needed to fight as well as their masters in battle. Eric passed through the quarters consisting of 50 cabins side by side. The dim corridors smelled of a mix of horses, hay, and dung. When he entered the second stable, 2 novices were whipping Allain's warhorse, Lupus. Eric accelerated and started running. His eyebrows furrowed as he ran, and lightning began to flash in his eyes. One of the novices held his bitten shoulder, and the other continued to beat the horse in the small stable with anger. When the whip, making a sound like the wind in the air, struck the horse again, a storm hit both novices. The 2 novices were thrown to the ground, and as they looked in surprise at what had hit them, Eric had turned. Eric loved Lupus, who had turned. The 2 novices, who had risen in anger to attack Eric, realized that they were not enough to fight him. He bit me, said one of the young men. The other young man chimed in, saying, horses should know their master. In support of his friend, but Eric paid no attention to them. Lupus, on the other hand, had calmed down when Eric began to pet him and had started to grumble in his own way. A burly, long-haired, bearded knight observed them from a distance and asked, is this the slave who came with Allain de Bures? Baron Stenkel von Bentheim, with his hands clasped behind his back, held a long whip between his hands. Baron was responsible for the training of the Templar knight novices. Yes, my lord. What's his name? Baron Stenkel von Bentheim inquired. The knight did not have him register the name de Bures, said the novice knight Thomas de Vullen. A tall, dark-haired young man who, even under his armor, revealed a robust physique. Thanks to the adventure he had in early summer, he had risen from a novice to a novice knight, carrying a sword at his waist and owning a white robe with a red cross. His name is not worth recording, for we cannot allow such filth to enter our temple and defile its sanctity, Baron Stenkel von Bentheim grumbled. Furthermore, everyone should know their place. As you command, my lord. The Grand Master asked, What about Hasan Sabbah? What happened to him? Inquired Allain. Did you gather any information about him? I have nothing useful, my lord, just some absurd children's stories. Those children's stories killed Nizam al-Mulk, he said, spreading his hands. After all, Nizam al-Mulk was the vizier of the Seljuk Empire. The assassination of a king's second-in-command in his own palaces would frighten any ruler. Yes, his men are quite skilled, Allain nodded. Crowds? In the last report that came in, it was mentioned that they have an army, Right Hand inquired. The person who wrote the report might not have seen an army before, my lord, Allain said arrogantly. Are you sure? Asked the Grand Master. Of course, my lord, Allain replied confidently. Due to their scarcity, they have such high quality and skilled men. Otherwise, they would have infantry that could conquer cities. However, Giorgio, who seemed unconvinced, insisted, assassins. They consume hashish, and Sabbah has deceived them, and... Ah, I know those stories too, Allain said, dismissing it with a wave of his hand. No, it's completely nonsense. Sabbah's fedayeen are devoted to the real religion and their master. Sabbah is not a foolish religious leader, he does not send unreliable men to his targets. Intelligent, role-playing men whom you cannot escape when they get close are good men. They call each other Refik, the equivalent of companion in our terms. Sometimes they call themselves fedayeen, fedai, which means sophist in our language. They are a small sect, just like us. They pledge undying loyalty to the leader of their sect, just like we do. The orders of the sheiks are unquestioned, and there is no doubt. Like all of us, when they die, they go to their place in heaven without doubting their goals. They sacrifice themselves and their victims to that idea under the command of their sheiks, just like us. We confront armies, and they focus on killing a single person. They wait for years and take positions for that purpose. Generally, their targets are not Christians. They kill targets who have personal matters with their own sect. They have conflicts with Sunnis, all of them are in the Ismaili sect. Are you sure? Giorgio asked in amazement. While Allain claimed to have nothing useful, he suddenly provided a detailed intelligence report. Moreover, this report was the most detailed one he had heard so far. I've seen a few daggers up close, my lord, said Allain. Sabbah carefully selects his men and never sends an incompetent one, no matter what the task. They only use daggers, and when they complete their missions, they shout, I am Hasan Sabbah's fedayeen, and await punishment. Because their lives of suffering in this world are over. Now, according to their beliefs, they will go to their paradise. You seem especially chosen to annoy me, de Bures, grumbled the Grand Master. Allain helplessly shrugged. I'm sorry, my lord, but if you get too carried away with absurd stories in my world, you might not wake up again. I'll keep that in mind, sighed Gilbert Joseph Harai with distress. Hasan ibn Sabbah, a truly cunning man who has been propagandizing in his region for 10 years. He's not just an intellectual but an adventurer as well. He exploits the 400 years of evolving Sunni animosity and essentially uses the foundations of the Dalers. That's why they call his men fedayeen. I wish we had sent you for him, said Right Hand. Why is the Templar Order concerned with Hasan Sabbah? Allain asked. We're not concerned, we've put a bounty on his head, replied Right Hand. Why would we do such a thing? The Grand Master responded with a slight smile. The climate of fear he has created and the chaos caused by his murders constitute an lawlessness that we cannot accept in our lands. First and foremost, we have a responsibility given to us by God to protect the subjects of our kingdom and the peace of innocent people. Allain didn't believe a single word said. Putting a bounty on Hasan Sabbah's head would endanger every Templar house opened in that region, risking every brother there. These men were not fools, they knew the consequences. If they had taken this risk, Sabbah must have done something significant to draw the attention of the order. Allain was secretly curious about this reason but didn't ask them. Instead, he changed the subject. So, what's our situation? Our gracious king, may he live long, healthy, and peaceful, told us that we can use the Temple of Solomon throughout his lifetime, Right Hand explained. In return, our knights, when joining us, will swear loyalty to him. It doesn't seem to bother you as if it were nothing, my lord. Why should it bother? The kingdom of Jerusalem is the only kingdom built on Christianity outside of Rome. It is not a kingdom of languages, races, and lineages but a kingdom of Christianity. He, like us, has pledged allegiance to elevate Christianity. He is also a member of the order, as much as we are, added Allain. With a subtle movement of his shoulder, Giorgio raised it, saying, "That's true." Grand Master chuckled. At the same time, our beloved Pope has issued Omne Datum Optimum. Now we are under the protection of the papacy. We have immunity from church taxes and courts. We can now collect taxes from our own members, and we are not subject to any secular court or kingdom. So, on one hand, we swear allegiance to our member Baldwin, but we are not bound to him as he is bound to Rome through the oath of allegiance, Allain said with a smile. This confusion was a situation he was familiar with. The life of the order's knights was often similar to the life of the monks of the Benedictine order. They had a simplified structure that valued prayer and eremitism. However, once integrated into the world, some boundaries could become blurred, such as swearing an oath somewhere while another place released them from those oaths. "Yes, my dear son," said the Grand Master with a gentle smile. "At the same time, as always, we are under siege. In the south, beyond the barren lands, there are the Fatimids. To the east, the Abbasids surround us, gathering their strength. We can easily go as far as Alexandretta along the coast, but beyond that, it gets complicated. But we are preparing for war." Right Hand and the Grand Master briefly looked at each other. "How did you reach this conclusion, de Bures?" Right Hand asked. Allain smiled. "Preparations are evident, my lord, if you know where to look." "Do others understand?" the Grand Master asked with concern. "They won't understand before it's too late, my lord," Allain replied. The visibly relieved man let out a breath he had been holding. "The good king has instructed us to be careful and keep our mouths shut." Allain only said, "Understood, my lord," in response to the unspoken order of silence from the Grand Master. At the corner of the temple courtyard, outside a dedicated hall for the commanders of the city guards, Bernard sat at a small table, contemplating where to begin his investigation as he looked at the map in front of him. Numerous questions swirled in his mind. Why was Arnaldo de Payanes murdered? Why were they tortured? Arnaldo de Payanes rarely left his farm, which was no longer in operation. Who could have angered him? He couldn't determine their last interactions or conversations because everyone who could have known was killed that night. Had he offended a guest who visited him? Was it an intentional crime? No, it couldn't be. Bernard couldn't make sense of it, but he was sure it wasn't intentional. Could it have been theft? No, that didn't add up either. All the valuable items in the house were still there, brought in by the city guard who had visited just before. Among them were 4 bags of silver, part of Payanes' salary that he hadn't distributed to his employees, and a bag of gold. What about Titus Morgan? Why should Bernard disregard Titus Morgan? He couldn't recall the man's face, only the face of the slave came to mind. As he looked at the whip on the table, he thought about the expression on the young man's face. Not fear, not anger, something else. Something Bernard had seen, tasted, and been afraid of before. Something he couldn't name. Bernard swallowed. Straightening up with a grunt, he stretched to relieve the ache in his back, lifting and dropping his shoulders. If it wasn't theft, perhaps he could gather information from thieves. He knew there was a thieves' guild. He had heard them call themselves a guild shamelessly a few times. He contemplated whether to order his men to find this guild, but he was sure it wasn't theft. With grape leaves shading him from the sun, and a servant bringing him cold sherbet, Bernard made a mental note to find the thieves' guild. The men he had sent to the door were returning one by one, mostly empty-handed, and no one had seen a suspicious figure they could remember. As he considered returning to Mount of Olives, 2 riders burst into the courtyard, kicking up dust. The city guards atop their horses directed their attention towards Bernard upon seeing him. Approaching him and saluting, they asked, "What happened?" The older city guard respectfully replied, "We need your opinion, Sir de Sonnac. For the noble killed in the southern district." Bernard furrowed his brows. "Who has died?" he asked. "Guido Lorenzio from the Genoese Trade Guild," the city guard replied. Bernard looked at the two men and asked, "Why aren't you investigating?" "Sir, the matter has become too extensive, and the old man was killed with torture," the second city guard explained with distress. Bernard, walking toward his horse with a troubled expression, grumbled, "I'm coming." Allain de Bures glanced again at the beggar on the corner as he left the temple. The old man had disappeared, replaced by someone else. The sun seemed determined to pierce through, prompting him to pull the hood of his cloak over his head. His sword was visible beneath the thin fabric of his robe. The stone and dirt streets of Jerusalem were illuminated as he walked, bustling with crowds. The closer he got to the market, the more congested the streets became. Approaching the marketplace where rows of stalls were displayed, the vibrant colors of fresh fruits and vegetables caught his eye. Apples, grapes, and pomegranates formed colorful piles, while exotic scents from the spice stalls filled the air. Traders behind meticulously arranged stalls, spending hours to present a bustling and affluent image, haggled with customers. Allain examined the colorful array of handmade fabrics and lace-adorned dresses. He ran his hands over soft silk fabrics, bargaining for a roll of fabric with a merchant. During a brief pause in the negotiation, he checked behind him, smiling when he noticed two young men following him. In truth, that was the only reason he had been looking at the fabrics. Amidst the noise of the market, the heart of trade beating, conversations in various languages echoed in his ears. Italians, French, Romans, Muslims, Christians, and Jews mingled, sharing their languages, religious beliefs, and traditions. At one point in his walk, he noticed a gathering of priests. Dressed in white robes, they stood out, reciting prayers and performing religious rituals. Allain allowed them to pass, like any other procession in the market, while still keeping in mind how the streets of the market interconnected. It was impossible to reach his destination with those behind him, but if he could lose them, he knew that the next time, more cunning or experienced followers might be on his trail. This dilemma was a common part of being pursued. He engaged in routine conversations with traders, handing 2 coins to one, taking a bunch of grapes in return, and continued walking while snacking on grapes. Some merchants recognized him, he chatted with them, exchanged pleasantries with others, and walked on. As he continued his stroll, the splendor of palaces and mansions started to feel more familiar, more accustomed. Jerusalem was indeed a capital, dazzling to behold. It couldn't be compared to Rome or Constantinople, but still, watching it, passing through it, brought him pleasure. Towers made of stone and elegant courtyards reflected their wealth. These places, where nobles lived, had once hosted kings and aristocrats and had also witnessed brutal killings of people. Allain grumbled without finding pleasure in the cruel joke his mind played on him. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they slaughtered every soldier, woman, and child. Some streets were filled knee-deep with blood. Those who settled here since then slept with the thought that one day Muslims would take revenge for this massacre. It was one of the harsh realities of living in Jerusalem. One day, the possibility of facing the sins of the past. In the market, street performers in colorful costumes presented acrobatic displays and musical performances. Acrobats, turning their colorful juggling clubs to the music of 2 discordant flutes and a zurna, circled each other in a lively manner on a temporarily constructed stage. Allain, standing on the platform and enjoying the enthusiasm and skills of these street performers, watched as the crowd applauded them. After observing them for a while, he entered a small and crowded street behind him. This was the street of the old glass artisans. Some of the vibrant glass items were crafted here, some in Italy, and some in Constantinople. Allain particularly examined the glass items up to the 4th shop, then entered the 4th one. He handed the prepared 2 silver coins to the burly man who was looking at him with curiosity and took off his robe. Taking a deep breath, the man, taking the silver coins, said quickly, I didn't know you had returned to the city, my lord. It's good to see you, Poitras, Allain replied, helping him put on the robe and placing the hood on him just as he did. Lord, how long should I keep them occupied? An hour will suffice, said Allain as he took the dark brown robe hanging on a hook. The heavily bearded, thick-browed man, making sure not to show his face and looking to the other side, said quickly, Welcome to Jerusalem, my lord. Allain went behind the shop, exited onto the next street through a small gap, and returned to the square. Walking in the opposite direction from here, he headed to the southern part of the city. Under the large tree across from the worn-out building, once a mosque but now converted into a church, he shook hands with the Mongol waiting for him. He smiled at the Chinese woman and, together, the three went to sit at the spacious table set outside a nearby inn. The Chinese woman ordered sherbet, and the two men requested wine and cheese. After the innkeeper brought them freshly baked bread and grapes as a complimentary gesture, he left them alone. The Mongol was not tall but quite robust. After scanning his surroundings, he asked, Where's Eric? Cleaning up horse shit. At the temple? Chuckled the Mongol. Yes. After contemplating at least a dozen problems that Eric could cause, the woman spoke in a sly, silky voice, You could have found something less flamboyant than burning down the temple. She had covered the hood of her robe and, like the other Saracen women, fashioned a headpiece from a lavish fabric, securing it around her head. A silver braided ornament adorned her forehead. Instead of responding, Allain just smiled. Meanwhile, the Mongol asked, How was the meeting? It went as I expected, Allain replied, wrinkling his face as he sipped his wine. Has the Grand Master really died? The Chinese woman, Yuajai Lin, inquired. Yes, his assistant has taken his place, Allain said. He had already learned of the Grand Master's death near Iran. What did you do? Yuajai Lin asked. I acted surprised, Allain replied, smiling at her. Why don't you trust your own brotherhood? The Mongol, Subute, questioned. Don't you know me yet, Subute? Allain asked, smiling at him. I do, but asking is still amusing, Christian, Subute remarked, putting a piece of cheese into his mouth. Have you settled in? Allain inquired. He had already told them where to go and how to introduce themselves before entering the city. Allain de Bures rarely engaged in unplanned activities. Yes, Yuajai Lin replied. Stay low-key, Allain advised, raising his wine to his head. He had little time, he needed to make the most of it. Tossing a silver coin onto the table, he stood up. As he rose, Subute grumbled, I'm a Mongol, she's Chinese. Do you realize how difficult what you're asking is here? Life is not easy, Allain replied before blending into the crowd on the street. Eric skidded and tumbled backwards. As he tried to recover, someone else hit him with a training spear and he fell out of the shadows of the barn and onto the dirt field that was the training ground. 2 cadets emerged from the north gate, 3 from the east gate and 2 from the south gate. They were dressed in black, like servants, and wore red sashes to identify them as novices. 6 young men came out of the stable, wielding thick wooden swords that they used as longswords. The novices who had just arrived had told them that a slave had attacked them. The novices had their own laws, slaves, servants, could not touch them. They were noble-blooded, knight candidates. Servants, captives and slaves had to know their place. And then these rules were the unwritten laws that everybody knew. Well, almost everyone. Eric, for example, didn't know this rule. Or maybe he did, but he didn't really care, I'm not sure. Eric stood up on his left knee, right fist on the floor, left hand on his knee, leaning forward, head bowed. Hold it right there, dog, I'll teach you your place, said Klaus Gaband. He was the biggest young man amongst the apprentices. He approached him with his training sword tucked between his armrests, tugging at his pants under his ear. He was going to punish this young man as he had learned as a child, urinate on his head, and then expect the slave to thank him for rewarding him with his piss. Klaus stood in front of the young man as those who had come with him surrounded Eric. Eric's eyes widened as he pulled down his pants as he had intended. The young man rose quickly, and before Klaus knew he had hit him, he struck him hard in the jaw from below with the palm of his hand. Klaus toppled backwards like a tower, while the surrounding freshmen looked on in amazement. They only realized that Eric had even taken the practice sword from Klaus when Eric started swinging the weapon. The first man stood behind Eric, who quickly drew the wooden sword from Klaus's armpit, struck the handle in the center of the forehead and fell over, just like Klaus. The second man was the swarthy young man standing next to Klaus. He had almost reacted enough to strike back but had only half raised his weapon when the blunt end of the wooden sword sank like a fist into his diaphragm. The young man fell to his knees, eyes and mouth open in horror. Finally one of the novices sprang into action and lunged at him, raising his sword above his head, just as he had been trained to do. But Eric was already on the move. He moved swiftly between Klaus and the young man who had fallen to his knees beside him, and just as swiftly he spun around and swung the sword. He had swung his sword behind his back specifically to defend against a sword swung from behind him, but the novices were far more clumsy and naive than he had expected. Eric shoved the toe of his boot under the toe of one of the young men who tried to run at him and quickly threw sand in his face, while he met the other's training spear with his sword and slid to the side. He moved constantly, like the Mongol Subyutei had trained him, like the Chinese Yuej, filling the gaps like water, being fluid. Along the way they had trained him, reminded him to be human and shared what they knew with him. As she passed the man she had thrown sand in the face of, she struck him in the kidneys with the wooden training sword she held by the handle with one hand and in the center of his torso with the other, causing him to fall screaming to the ground. At the same time, he ducked and dodged the sword of an apprentice who swung his sword behind him. He quickly turned around and walked backwards to face the 7 young men who had attacked him. He was no longer under siege, he was now being attacked by a disorganized, angry and distracted mass of young men who had not completed their training. Eric, in contrast, was fully concentrated on fighting. His blue eyes, under his furrowed brow, glittered like shards of ice. His attackers were coming at him in a first group of 3 and a second group of 4. He retreated towards the big wall on the side of the pitch they had come out of. Then he was thinking as Allain had trained him to think. He was now free of his emotions, free of his anger, free of his desires, focused only on his plan, on the situation at that moment. Up to that point he had to reduce their number. As the first wooden sword swiftly met his sword, he shifted to the left instead of standing in the center. As Subyutei had told him, he was using the advantage of the enemy being crowded against them. Yes, there were many of them, but they couldn't get to Eric without surrounding him and hitting his own friends, and the recruits had only learned one sword system so far. They were using the Italian sword style because the Italians were more advanced in swordsmanship. Despite running, the novice raised his sword above his head with la posti falcone. This stance, called the falcon stance, was only open to the eastern currents. The Italian sword currents, designed for heavy swords and heavy armor, were vulnerable to the fast movements of the east. Eric had already realized this while working with Allain. With the wooden sword raised above his head, Eric suddenly moved forward instead of backward, and before it landed on his head he used his own wooden sword to push the young novice backwards under the chin, sliding out of the group as he did so. As the young man crashed to the ground, Eric dodged the sword swinging at him with his body, meeting the other with his sword. A snake coiled around his throat and pulled him back with great force. "Tie him to the pole," said Baron Stenkel von Bentheim, seated on a warhorse, as he recovered his whip. Eric vaguely recognized the pole he was being dragged to. When he realized this, his eyes widened, his gaze was piercing. The 2 idiots who thought they were holding him tightly were about to realize their big mistake, because the cruelest, worst pains of Eric's life were the things that happened to him while he was tied to a pole. Eric could easily have killed them for what they had done, but before it came to that, a Servians, realizing that the young man would resist them, struck him again in the back of the head with the handle of a wooden sword. By this time the training ground was crowded with many knights, millets, Servians, and clarisses. They were to watch the slave tied to the pole being flogged by Baron Stenkel von Bentheim. Still unconscious, Eric's vest was removed and his tunic and shirt cut off. Most of the novices stayed where they were when the cloth was torn. The young man's back was covered with whip wounds, burn marks and the memory of battle. "What is this nonsense?" roared a loud, powerful and commanding voice. As the Grand Master entered the training field with long strides, everyone on the field turned to him and bowed their heads in salute to the Grand Master. "Sir, the indiscipline of a slave is being punished." "Is that so? What happened here, Brother Sebastian?" "Sir," Sebastian said hesitantly, looking at the Baron, "I'm afraid there was a great misunderstanding." The Grand Master had assigned Sebastian to watch Allain's slave. The young men were bitten by the warhorse, and without thinking they tried to punish them, because they were ordered to do so, he said quickly. So he summarized the situation without offending them. The young man must have thought the horse was going to hurt them, so he shouldered them and took care of the horse. The youth, thinking that a slave had attacked